I've been camping for most of my life. I've spent nights in national parks, deep forests, and remote wilderness areas all across the United States. I've dealt with storms. I've dealt with bears. I've even gotten lost a few times. But none of those experiences prepared me for what happened during the summer of 2024. It started as a simple weekend trip. My friend Jake and I planned a 3-day backpacking hike through a remote section of forest in northern Pennsylvania. Neither of us had been there before. That was the reason we picked it. We wanted a place that felt untouched, a place where we could disappear for a few days. No crowds, no traffic, no cell service, just forest. At the time, it sounded perfect. Looking back now, I wish we had chosen literally any other trail. We arrived at the trailhead shortly after noon. The weather couldn't have been better. Clear skies, cool air, no rain in the forecast. The first several hours were exactly what we expected. Quiet trails, dense forest, no other hikers. Around 6 in the evening, we started looking for a place to camp. That's when we found it. At first, it looked completely normal. 3 tents, a folding table, several camping chairs, a cooler, a fire pit, the kind of campsite you'd see in almost any state park. Jake called out, "Hello?" No answer. He tried again, still nothing. The campsite looked occupied, but there wasn't a single person anywhere. And the longer I stared at it, the stranger it felt. The first thing that bothered me wasn't the silence. It was how perfect everything looked. The tents were positioned neatly around the fire pit. The chairs faced inward. The cooler sat beside the table. Nothing appeared out of place. It looked staged, not messy like a real campsite, not lived in, arranged, almost like a display. At the time, I couldn't explain why that bothered me. I just remember feeling uncomfortable. Jake walked through the campsite while calling out for the owners. Nobody answered. There was food on the table, sleeping bags inside the tents, water bottles, backpacks. Everything suggested people had been there recently. Yet somehow the entire place felt empty, not abandoned, empty. There's a difference. And for the first time that day, I had the strange feeling that someone wanted us to find it. Jake suggested the owners were probably hiking nearby. Honestly, it was the only explanation that made sense. So after a few minutes, we continued down the trail. About a mile later, we found a clearing beside a creek and set up camp. The rest of the evening felt normal. We cooked dinner, talked for a while, watched the sun disappear behind the trees. Eventually, darkness settled over the forest. By 10 o'clock, both of us were exhausted. I climbed into my tent and fell asleep almost immediately. Then, sometime during the night, I woke up. At first I wasn't sure why. Everything was dark, everything was quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow footsteps, moving through the leaves outside the tent, and they were getting closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps moved around our campsite in a slow circle. One side of the tent, then the other, then behind me, then near Jake's tent. I could hear him moving around too. He was awake. Neither of us said a word. The footsteps continued for several minutes. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to hide. They weren't sneaking. They wanted us to hear them. Then suddenly, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I stayed awake for nearly an hour waiting for them to return. They never did. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been another camper. Maybe somebody who got lost. Maybe somebody looking for their campsite. But before I finally fell asleep, one thought kept repeating in my head. What if those footsteps belonged to the people from the empty campsite? And what if they had found us? The next morning, neither of us mentioned the footsteps right away. I think we were both trying to convince ourselves that it wasn't a big deal. The forest looked completely normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees. The creek flowed quietly beside our campsite. Nothing about the place felt threatening anymore. We packed our gear, ate breakfast, and got back on the trail. For the next few hours, everything seemed fine. Then, sometime around noon, Jake suddenly stopped walking. I nearly walked into him. At first, I thought he'd spotted wildlife. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. Instead, he slowly pointed through the trees ahead of us. The moment I saw what he was looking at, my stomach dropped. 3 tents, a folding table, several chairs, a cooler, the campsite, the exact same campsite, and somehow, it looked even more perfect than before. For several seconds, neither of us moved. There was no logical explanation. According to the GPS, we had traveled miles since the previous evening. We should have been nowhere near that campsite. Yet there it was, waiting for us. The closer we got, the more uncomfortable I became. Everything was exactly where I remembered it. The tents, the chairs, the cooler, even the fire pit looked untouched. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. There wasn't a single piece of trash anywhere. No wrappers, no empty bottles, no signs of actual use. The campsite looked occupied, but it didn't look lived in. It felt less like a campsite and more like a movie set, as if someone had carefully built it to look convincing. And for the first time, I seriously wondered whether finding it had been intentional. This time, we decided to search the area more carefully. The moment we stepped into the campsite, Jake noticed something sitting on the table, a stack of photographs. At first, I thought they belonged to the campers, maybe family pictures, vacation photos. But when I picked one up, I immediately realized something was wrong. The image showed a campsite, not this campsite, a different one. The next photograph showed another campsite, then another, and another. Every picture seemed to feature strangers. Most had been taken from a distance. Many appeared to be taken without the subjects knowing. The more photographs we looked through, the stranger they became. Families around campfires, people cooking dinner, campers sleeping inside tents. Every single image felt intrusive, like we were looking through the eyes of someone who had spent years secretly watching people. Then I noticed something that made my heart start racing. Most of the photographs had one thing in common. Somewhere in the background of nearly every picture was a campsite, 3 tents, a folding table, several chairs. The same campsite, the one standing right in front of us. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then Jake noticed it too. The campsite wasn't random. It appeared over and over again. Different years, different people, different locations, but always the same setup. The same 3 tents, the same chairs, the same cooler. That's when a horrible possibility entered my mind. What if the campsite wasn't where these people stayed? What if it was how they were found? And suddenly the entire place felt different, not abandoned, not mysterious, purposeful. Beneath the photographs, we found something else. A notebook. The cover was worn and faded. The pages inside were filled with handwritten entries, names, dates, locations. At first, it looked like an ordinary journal. Then I started reading. The first entry ended with a phrase that immediately caught my attention. Found the campsite. I turned the page. Different names, different date, same phrase. Found the campsite. Another page. Found the campsite. Again, and again, and again. The phrase appeared dozens of times. Almost every entry started the same way. Then the notes became shorter, more disturbing. Some ended with comments like, stayed the night, followed trail, moved north, and then on several pages, there were only 3 words. Never seen again. I looked at Jake. Jake looked at me. Neither of us spoke, because we were both thinking the same thing. The campsite wasn't abandoned, it was bait. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The notebook sat open on the table between us. I kept staring at the words. Found the campsite. The same phrase appeared over and over again. Dozens of names, dozens of dates, all connected by those 3 words. The more I thought about it, the worse it felt, because the entries weren't describing a destination, they were describing an event, like finding the campsite was the beginning of something, not the end. Jake finally broke the silence. We need to leave. I nodded immediately. For the first time since arriving in the forest, neither of us cared about understanding what was happening. We just wanted to get away from it. I closed the notebook and stood up. That's when Jake grabbed my arm, hard. I looked up and saw exactly what he was staring at. Someone was standing between the trees, watching us. The figure stood perfectly still, maybe 100 yards away, far enough that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to know they were looking directly at us. For several seconds, nobody moved. The forest around us felt completely silent. Then Jake shouted, "Hey!" No response. The figure didn't wave, didn't react, didn't move at all. It was like looking at a photograph. Then, slowly, the person stepped backward, 1 step, then another, until the trees swallowed them completely. We both started moving at the same time, not toward the figure, away from it. The notebook stayed on the table. The photographs stayed where they were. We left everything behind, because one thing had become painfully obvious. Whoever created that campsite knew we were there, and they had probably known for a while. For the next hour, we walked faster than we had at any point during the trip. Nobody spoke much. Every few minutes, one of us would glance over a shoulder. The feeling of being watched never disappeared. If anything, it got stronger. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees to my left. I stopped immediately. The movement stopped too. For several seconds, I stared into the forest. Nothing, just shadows, branches, trees. Then we continued walking. 20 minutes later, it happened again. Movement, same side of the trail, same feeling. This time, Jake saw it too. Neither of us said what we were thinking, because we already knew. Someone was following us, and they weren't trying very hard to hide it. Late that afternoon, we stopped to check the GPS. That's when we noticed something strange. The trail should have led directly back toward the parking area. Instead, our location seemed wrong. The signal kept drifting. Sometimes the arrow pointed in completely different directions. At first, we blamed poor reception. But then something happened that was harder to explain. We passed a fallen tree lying across the trail. I remembered it because one side of the trunk had been covered in bright green moss. About 40 minutes later, we passed the same tree again. The exact same tree. Jake stopped. So we're going in circles now. I wanted to argue. I wanted to come up with another explanation, but I couldn't, because I recognized it too. And suddenly I remembered something from the notebook. Several entries mentioned people changing direction after finding the campsite. Several entries mentioned people leaving. None mentioned people escaping. As the sun began dropping toward the horizon, panic started taking over. We weren't completely lost, but we weren't where we should have been either. The forest felt different now. Smaller, more confined. Every trail looked the same. Every direction felt wrong. Then Jake suddenly froze. I followed his gaze and immediately felt my stomach tighten. There he was again, the figure, standing between the trees. Closer this time, much closer. Still motionless, still watching. The distance had shrunk enough that I could make out a few details. Dark clothing, tall, thin, but the face remained hidden in shadow. We stared at him. He stared back. Then, for the first time, he moved. Not away from us, not behind a tree, toward us. One slow step, then another. That was enough. Jake turned and ran, and I ran right behind him. The moment Jake started running, I followed without hesitation. Branches whipped against our arms as we pushed through the forest. Neither of us cared about conserving energy anymore. We just wanted distance between ourselves and the man in the trees. For several minutes, all I could hear was our breathing and the sound of leaves crunching beneath our boots. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. Behind us. Not close, but definitely there. I glanced over my shoulder. At first, I saw nothing. Then I caught a glimpse of movement. A dark figure slipping between the trees, keeping pace. Not sprinting, not struggling to keep up. Just following. That terrified me more than if he had been chasing us, because it felt deliberate, controlled. Like he already knew exactly where we were going, and somehow, he wasn't worried about losing us. Eventually we slowed down, not because we felt safe, because we were exhausted. The forest around us had started growing darker. Sunlight barely reached the ground anymore. Jake bent over, trying to catch his breath. Neither of us had seen the figure for several minutes. For the first time, I thought maybe we'd finally lost him. Then I looked ahead and felt my stomach drop. 3 tents, a folding table, several chairs, the campsite. Again. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. We had been running in the opposite direction. There was no way we should have ended up back there. Yet somehow, the campsite stood directly in front of us, waiting. The worst part wasn't seeing it again. The worst part was realizing it no longer felt random. The campsite wasn't appearing by accident. Someone wanted us to keep finding it. This campsite looked almost identical to the first one. Almost. A few things had changed. The chairs were arranged differently. One tent appeared slightly open, and sitting in the middle of the table was something that hadn't been there before. A photograph. Just one. Jake grabbed it before I could. The moment he looked at it, the color drained from his face. Then he handed it to me. The photograph showed us, not earlier that day, not at the creek. It showed us running through the forest. The picture couldn't have been more than an hour old. Whoever had taken it had been close enough to capture both of us clearly, close enough to watch us while we fled. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message, just 3 words: keep moving north. Neither of us knew what that meant, but we knew one thing. The person following us wanted us scared, and they wanted us to know they were watching. We left immediately. Neither of us touched anything else. The photograph stayed in my pocket. As darkness settled over the forest, our only goal was reaching the parking lot. The GPS finally seemed to stabilize. For the first time all day, the route actually made sense. We followed it without stopping, without speaking, without looking back. Hours later, just after sunset, we finally saw the edge of the forest. Then the parking area. I've never felt relief like that before. The sight of Jake's truck felt like survival. For a few seconds, I genuinely believed the nightmare was over. Then we got closer, and the relief vanished instantly. All 4 tires had been slashed. Clean cuts, deliberate cuts. Not one tire, all 4. Someone had made sure that truck wasn't going anywhere. And suddenly the forest behind us felt much closer than before. Jake stood there staring at the damage. I remember slowly turning toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching us, waiting. Fortunately, we weren't alone for long. About an hour later, another group of hikers arrived at the parking area. 4 people, complete strangers. I've never been happier to see anyone in my life. They immediately noticed something was wrong. After hearing our story, they helped us contact park authorities. The call took longer than expected because reception was terrible. Eventually, we reached a ranger station. The ranger asked dozens of questions. Most of them focused on the campsite, the photographs, the notebook, the figure. At one point, there was a long silence on the line. Then the ranger asked something strange. "Did the notebook mention other hikers?" I told him yes. Another pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Stay where you are." His voice sounded different now, serious, concerned. "As far as I'm aware, you're not the first people to report that campsite. We spent the night near the parking area with the other hikers. Nobody slept much. Every sound coming from the forest grabbed our attention. Every snapping branch made us look toward the tree line. I kept thinking about what the ranger had said. You're not the first people to report that campsite." The more I thought about it, the worse it became. How many people had found it before us? How many names in that notebook belonged to real people? And how many of those people had never been found? Just after sunrise, 3 park rangers arrived. We told them everything: the empty campsite, the photographs, the notebook, the man watching us from the trees, the second campsite, the photograph telling us to keep moving north. The rangers listened carefully. Unlike most people, they didn't seem skeptical. If anything, they seemed concerned. Then one of them unfolded a map and pointed toward a remote section of forest. "We're going back in." And for the first time since leaving the woods, I realized the story wasn't over yet. The search lasted most of the day. Jake and I stayed behind while the rangers headed into the forest. Hours passed without any updates. Around noon, one of the radios suddenly crackled to life. A ranger answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but whatever was said changed everything. The ranger's expression disappeared. He turned toward the others. "They found something." Nobody explained what that something was. Not immediately. About an hour later, we were driven to a remote clearing several miles from the trail system. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just trees, brush, rocks. Then I noticed a structure hidden among the forest. A cabin, old, weathered, almost invisible beneath the trees. The location wasn't marked on any public map, and according to the rangers, it shouldn't have been there at all. But it was, and someone had clearly been using it. The cabin looked abandoned from the outside. The windows were dirty. The roof sagged slightly. The paint had almost completely faded away. But the moment we stepped inside, it became obvious that somebody had been living there. There was canned food, bottled water, flashlights, batteries, blankets, a generator. Everything needed to survive for long periods without leaving the forest. The place wasn't abandoned. It was occupied. Or at least it had been recently. Then one of the rangers led us into a second room. The moment I entered, I stopped walking. Boxes, dozens of them, stacked from floor to ceiling. Every box was filled with photographs. Thousands of photographs, maybe tens of thousands. People camping, people hiking, people sitting around campfires, people sleeping, people completely unaware they were being watched. The room didn't feel like part of a home. It felt like evidence. The rangers spent hours sorting through the photographs. The deeper they looked, the stranger everything became. Most of the pictures had something in common. Somewhere in the image, the campsite appeared, sometimes clearly, sometimes hidden in the background. But it was always there. The same 3 tents, the same chairs, the same table. Eventually, one of the rangers said something that completely changed the way I viewed the entire situation. This wasn't a campsite. At first, nobody understood what he meant. Then he pointed toward a series of photographs. Each image showed different people, different years, different locations. But every group had stopped at the campsite before being photographed elsewhere. The ranger looked directly at us. That campsite wasn't where he stayed. He paused. It was where he found people. The room went silent, because suddenly everything made sense. The notebook, the photographs, the repeated phrase. The campsite wasn't abandoned. It was bait. Once that idea took hold, the entire story changed. The campsite wasn't random. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a place people were supposed to stay. It was a trap. A carefully constructed trap. Something designed to attract attention, to make hikers stop, to make them curious, to make them approach. Then one ranger discovered another detail. Many of the photographs were organized into folders. Each folder belonged to a different group of people. Inside were dozens of images, sometimes hundreds. The photographs followed the same pattern. The first pictures showed people near the campsite. The next pictures showed them on trails, then at their campsites, then leaving the forest. And in some cases, the photographs continued long after the trip ended. At homes, at workplaces, at grocery stores. Whoever lived in that cabin wasn't just watching strangers in the woods. He was selecting people and then following them. That realization terrified me more than anything else we had discovered. The photographs were horrifying, but they weren't the worst thing inside the cabin. That discovery came later. One of the rangers opened a locked storage cabinet near the back wall. Inside were dozens of VHS tapes, maybe 50, maybe more. Each tape had a handwritten label, dates, locations, descriptions. Some labels were simple. Blue Tent, Family Camp, North Trail. Others contained names. The tapes were immediately collected as evidence, but before they were removed, one of the rangers decided to review a few of them. An old television and VHS player sat on a nearby table. The first tape showed a campsite, a family sleeping inside a tent. Nothing happened. Nobody spoke. The camera never moved. For nearly 6 hours, the person filming simply stood there, watching. The second tape was almost identical, then the third, then the fourth. Every recording showed the same behavior. Hours of silent observation, hours of waiting, hours of watching people who had no idea they were being recorded. It wasn't curiosity, it was obsession. Then one of the rangers picked up a tape with a date written on the label. The moment I saw it, my stomach tightened. It matched the weekend of our trip. At first, I hoped it was a coincidence. Then the tape started playing. The screen filled with static. A few seconds later, I recognized the creek, then the trees, then our campsite. Nobody in the room said a word, because we all understood what we were looking at. This wasn't somebody else's recording. It was ours. The camera stood only a few yards from our tent, close enough to hear our voices, close enough to capture every movement. The timestamp showed just after midnight, and for the next several hours, the camera never moved. Whoever filmed us had stood there the entire night, watching us sleep, watching us without making a sound, watching us without being seen. The footage continued, hour after hour. The image barely changed. The tent remained still, the forest remained quiet, but eventually, something caught my attention. The camera wasn't perfectly steady. Every few seconds, the image shifted slightly. Not because the person filming was moving, because they were breathing. The realization made my skin crawl. The person behind that camera wasn't passing through. They weren't checking on us. They weren't lost. They were standing there, intentionally, watching. Then, just before sunrise, something happened. For the first time in the recording, the camera began turning. Slowly, almost carefully. Everyone in the room leaned closer to the screen, because we all knew what was about to happen. For the first time, we might finally see who had been behind the camera, and who had been watching people for all those years. The camera continued turning, slowly, painfully slowly. Then a reflection appeared. A small mirror hanging inside the cabin. The person filming had positioned themselves directly in front of it. For the first time, we saw them. A dark mask covered their face. No visible skin, no identifiable features. Nothing. The figure stood motionless for several seconds. Then the screen filled with static. The recording ended. That was the closest anyone ever came to identifying the person responsible. No fingerprints were recovered. No DNA. No records. No name. Nothing. The investigation continued for months before eventually going cold. The cabin was emptied. The evidence was archived. The search ended. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least I thought it had. About 6 months later, I received an envelope in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single photograph of my house. The photograph had been taken at night. The angle suggested it was shot from behind a row of trees across the street. On the back were 4 handwritten words: "You made it home." I contacted the police. Nothing came from it. No fingerprints, no leads, no suspects. After that, I installed security cameras around my property. For months, nothing happened. Then one night, nearly a year after the camping trip, a motion alert woke me at 3:17 in the morning. I opened the security app. A person was standing at the edge of my property, not moving, not walking, just watching the house. The image quality was poor, but I immediately recognized the posture, the stillness, the way they stood. It looked exactly like the figure we had seen in the forest. Police arrived minutes later. The person was gone. A few months after that, I sold the house and moved several states away. For almost a year, nothing happened. Then one morning I received an email. No sender, no message, only a photograph. The image showed me leaving my new house that very morning, holding a cup of coffee. Someone had found me again. At the bottom of the picture were 5 words: "I liked the old house better." I never discovered who sent it. I never learned who lived in that cabin. And I never found out how long they had been following me. But after everything that happened, one thought still keeps me awake at night. Maybe the campsite was never the point. Maybe it was just a way to find people. And maybe I was one of the people it found.